My final standard. Remember, I teach U.S. history. There are 5 standards total. They're not organized in a particularly chronological way. It's more like concept sort of way. And I'm going through and trying to point out some reasons as to why it might be necessary to have the addition of other viewpoints in our lessons. I'm a teacher who firmly believes that all students should be able to see themselves represented in their materials in a positive way. That means the inclusion of diverse perspectives a lot of the time. And in our standards, that might be lacking a little bit. The 5th standard is my final standard. Let's see what's in it. We start with the Great Depression, and in that particular part, we discuss the impacts on the economy, starting with bank failures, a dependence on credit, how agriculture was already in decline prior to this whole situation. And then we talk about the New Deal and how they specifically impacted my particular state. Most of those, especially how they worked out in my state, benefited people from largely European backgrounds. Not all, but mostly. From there, we head into World War II, specifically the United States and their wartime contributions, focused on my state in particular. There is a little bit of mention of the folks from my area that played an interesting role. We do see a little diversity here where we do talk about the Tuskegee Airmen, so that's good. We mention the Japanese internment camps. However, I don't really feel like that's a positive representation of someone. But we do get to mention the German or prisoner of war camps as well that were in the United States, as well as some of the wartime strategies, tactics, all that good stuff, and famous folks from my state who played a role there. We also talk about how the economy booms during the wartime, and so that's good for business. And we talk about how military bases opened from World War I, they reopened, and that caused an economic boom, and those many of those bases are still open, which is part of our economy to this very day. We also mention Executive Order 9981, which desegregated the military, and we do discuss the GI Bill, but unfortunately the GI Bill was operated by the states, and states, especially in the southern areas where you have your largest African American populations, made it very, very difficult for African Americans to, or if not impossible, for African Americans to partake in this. So most of them did not receive that benefit. We then get into some demographic shifts following World War II. We talk about white flight, which is when white folks decided to move to the suburbs and leave the cities as African American people moved in. Not exactly a positive viewpoint, so very still Eurocentric. Then we have the post-war Jewish refugees, Hispanic immigration, especially to the southwestern areas. We talk a lot about the discrimination there, so again, not super positive on that. From there, we move into more civil rights stuff, so that we do see a little bit more inclusion here, but you know, it's fine. We talk about how the South transitioned from being part of the Democratic Party to being part of the Republican Party, led in large part by Strom Thurmond. He's that guy who just had his record for the longest speech on the Senate floor absolutely trashed by Cory Booker. I'm for it. He spoke for 24 hours and 18 minutes about why civil rights shouldn't happen. Civil rights for African American people, anyway. And then we get into a brief transition to the Dixiecrat Party from the Democrats, because the Democrats started to have more African American support, especially in the northern states, and they were good with that because they still wanted those votes. So lots of southern states pivoted, and then once the Dixiecrat Party did not really gain a whole lot of traction outside of the South, they then moved to the Republican Party, and the South has stayed part of the solid South, voting Republican pretty much since then. We do get into some of the events and legal cases surrounding civil rights. We talk about the shift in African American people being allowed to vote in primary elections. We talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We get into some of the reasons why the civil rights movement was seen as necessary, such as the blinding of Isaac Woodard, a mass amounts of lynching that broke out once again after the war ended. We discuss school equalization in the South and how that took a very extensive time period to complete. We mention the cases that led to the Brown versus Board decision, and we discuss some of the events that happened to push that forward. We talk about the desegregation of universities as well as different sit-ins across the time period. We discuss one of the first sit-ins in the country that introduced the tactic of jail no bail into the civil rights sort of practices. We discuss the White Citizens Council in response and how they were supposed to find ways to make sure that schools never desegregated. We, of course, talk about the Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, and how the NAACP helped lead the legal fight in this particular instance. We do discuss Loving versus Virginia, and that's pretty much where that ends. From there, we talk about the current economy of the U.S. and my state in particular. And we discuss how globalization has impacted our economic development, and we talk about the importance of tourism and manufacturing in our economy, about how different foreign companies like to come to my state in particular because we are a right-to-work state, and that's very, very good. We offer incentives to people who will bring their jobs here at the expense of the people who work there. That's, again, different story, different day. And we talk about how the military is still a very prominent source of income and revenue for our state as well. We also discuss some of the education legislation that has impacted my state and trying to equalize rural education, because that is something that's been very difficult here, just funding-wise and access-wise. And then we kind of wrap up with my state currently. We talk about some of the civil rights events that have happened in more recent history, about, for example, the removal of the Confederate flag from our state house, which was done very, very recently. We talk about how there have been mass events of violence aimed at African American people, and so we kind of point out that we are still working on things. It comes to the conclusion that there is a reason that we need to add some things to our curriculum, and why maybe diversity and inclusion are not horrible things. Why equity is necessary when we're talking about a group of people, because people are different. You can't expect everyone to learn the exact same way. It just doesn't work that way. We all process things differently. We all take information differently, and that's why we need to have access to a lot of different perspectives so that we can see a whole picture. So maybe, just maybe, DEI isn't scary, and maybe it could be helpful. I don't know.